I'm joined today by David Zetland, who is a water economist, the author of Living with Water Scarcity, and professor at Leiden University College in the Netherlands. David, it's so great to have you here. We've been talking about issues related to water for many years. This includes water shortages and droughts, the bottled water industry, lack of clean drinking water in much of the world. And I think a good place to start would be just to ask you, when you think of all of the issues around water today, what's the most pressing to you?
Governance. I think the way that we divide and manage water is increasingly critical in the world because there's more people wanting less water.
Explain that. There's more people wanting less water. Someone might say, well, don't we have the same amount of water on the planet total at all times? Is that not correct?
That is correct from a physical perspective. It is incorrect from a, if you want, either economic or useful perspective. Obviously, you can go to the ocean right now and there's plenty of water. You can't drink it. You can't use it to make silicon chips. You can't use it for the toilet. So the water that we want to use is a lot smaller proportion than the water that we see outside. And the challenge is getting it from one form into another form, whether it's a physical form or a locational form.
Okay, and I want to get to desalinization a little bit later, but let's first start with some basic numbers. What percentage of all of the water on the planet is without any treatment whatsoever, what we would consider drinkable water?
Far less than 1%.
Less than 1%?
Yeah, far less. And even rainwater has got contamination in it, unlike the scenario, for example, in Dr. Strangelove. Rainwater can it can remove particulate matter from the air and therefore be contaminated. Most groundwater is, in many parts of the world, is in good condition in terms of quality, but there's an increasing amount of groundwater which is contaminated in many countries. And then you have surface water, which is almost by definition going to be contaminated, sometimes to the point of being dangerous. And then you have basically snow and ice. So that 1% actually does represent quite often snow and ice, but that's hard to get to.
And when we talk about the increasing water shortages here in the U.S., it's been particularly noticeable on the West Coast, but of course all over the world. We had a very long list that we talked about a few months ago. What's the primary cause for this shortage that is now being seen?
The basic economics are supply and demand. So the supply of water for most communities is a combination of surface storage, underground storage, aquifers, and surface moving water like rivers. And if there's a drought, then there's less water being delivered to surface sources like rivers or surface storage like reservoirs. And so that means there's not as much supply, and demand could be increasing because the drought also means higher temperatures, or demand can be stable. And in which case, if you're using water, you might be running out of your surface water, and that's why a lot of parts of the United States as well as the world are seeing increasing groundwater stress.
And is this a cyclical process in the sense that right now we're experiencing this, but it's reasonable to expect that at some point in the future it will be made up for by more water supply than the amount demanded? Or is there something about human activity on Earth today that is pushing this in a way that goes beyond just the natural cycle?
There's two answers to that. The first one is to do with climate change, which is what people tend to call the end of stationarity, or the move to non-stationarity. And what that means is that the temperatures and the precipitation cycles are moving out of an area that we're familiar with. And that can mean good news in some ways because you'll have a lot more rain. It could mean bad news because you'll have a much longer drought. It can mean terrible news, meaning you'll have terrible storms and floods. So climate change is showing up in various ways. The other problem that we're having in terms of cycles is that traditionally we have been able to tap into groundwater supplies when there was not a lot of, there was a drought, for example. And that has continued to happen over decades. And that you can call that your bank account. And every time you run short of your weekly paycheck, you go to the bank and you get a little bit extra out of the groundwater account, let's say. And if you do that enough, there's not much left in the groundwater account. So what was a normal drought, or so the drought today might be equivalent to the drought 30 years ago, but we don't have as much groundwater around to buffer ourselves through that drought period. So that's causing more problems right now.
And when we talk about a water shortage, even that term has a drastically different meaning for someone in California as compared to someone in other parts of the world. And I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit. For someone in California, a water shortage might mean no washing of cars outdoors and try to limit the length of your showers. But
Right.
in other parts of the world, people literally do not have access to clean drinking water. What percentage of the world is in that latter state of affairs?
Well, the official UN statistics that are based on the Millennium Development Goal, which is to reduce the number of people without access to clean drinking water, that goal was redefined from clean drinking water to access to an improved water source, which means a pipe. And the pipe might not have drinkable water in it or water at all. So by that bureaucratic definition, there's 1 billion people who lack access to an improved water source. Other estimates have put the number of people who lack access to clean drinking water closer to 3 billion people.
So presumably there's some 2 million people there who may
2 billion.
have 2 billion, sorry, who may have a pipe, but that pipe is not actually providing water. So from a bureaucratic standpoint, they have access, but practically speaking, there's no actual clean drinking water available.
Right. So the water, they might get water 1 hour per day, or the water they get, they have to boil to make it clean. Sometimes they don't do that, so waterborne disease spreads and so on. So it's in some ways you're talking about parts of the world where people don't just go to the tap and turn it on and drink the water that comes out of it, which is something that most Americans take for granted.
When we talk about food supply, particularly in the United States, but even worldwide, many analyses have come to the conclusion that we are by no means in a situation where people are going hungry because of a lack of food. It's a distribution and allocation issue, a political will issue. When it comes to water, we're in maybe a slightly different scenario because there are actually shortages of water happening. So how would you characterize that? Could we get clean drinking water to everybody with no supply issues?
Yeah, you could. I mean, you have to remember that the water we drink is a very small proportion of the water we use. So the water we drink, people drink, let's say, at a maximum about 4 or 5 liters of water per day, or about just over a gallon of water per day for drinking purposes. In the United States, you'll have many communities where people are going to be using, say, 50 to 100 liters of water per day indoors. That translates into about 20 or 30 gallons of water. And then they're going to use double or triple that outdoors. And when you say there's a shortage of water, that doesn't mean you can't drink the water or you can't take a shower or prepare food. It means that you don't have enough water to water your lawn or wash down your driveway. From another perspective, if there's a shortage of water, it means that businesses might have to cut back on some activities. It means farmers will have to keep some land fallow and grow crops in other land. So shortages show up by reducing the activities that we can use water for, and that can have different impacts in different sectors of the economy.
Let's go back for a second to something you alluded to at the beginning of the interview, which is that most of the water which is freely available, we could go and grab a bucket, is salt water in the oceans.
Right.
What are the practical impediments to desalinization and other modification of salt water, as the term may be, for human use?
There's 2 main ones. One is money. It's very expensive to build an entire factory, essentially, for converting salt water into drinking water or into lesser salt water, because sometimes desalinated water is used for irrigation that would taste terrible to us. So money is a factor. And the other factor is the environmental impact of using a tremendous amount of energy to convert or to remove the salt from water. The oldest way of desalinating water is to evaporate it, and you have to boil water to evaporate it, and that takes a lot of energy. The newer methods use either physical or chemical tricks to reduce the cost of desalinating the water, but it's still extremely high relative to taking more or less clean water from the natural hydrological cycle.
So bearing that in mind and keeping in mind the shortages that we've talked about both over the last few months and years and with you today, when you look at the next 5, 10, and 20 years, what do you see as the best path forward? If it were up to you to provide recommendations to those who had the power and resources to make changes, where would money be best spent?
I think the first thing I would do is stop spending money in some places. So in fact, instead of spending money, I would remove subsidies towards water consumption in some places. In cities, there tend to be subsidies towards suburbs where they're building new networks, and the cost of the new network is not paid by the new occupants of the houses. In agriculture, you tend to have subsidies in terms of farmers paying 50% or 20% of the cost of the water that they're using. And if you would remove those subsidies, of course it would have a financial impact, but it would also make it those users of water a lot more careful about how much they use, because they would be paying a higher price. Once you got past that, there's extra steps which, as far as I'm concerned, should involve more pricing of water as a commodity. But it's important to remember that some water should not be treated as a commodity. It's the water that we have in our shared environment, for example.
We've been speaking with David Zetland. He is a water economist, author of Living with Water Scarcity, and professor at Leiden University College in the Netherlands. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.